Well, today we're going to begin looking at the story of Ruth. The book of Ruth is a short story that you can find right after the book of Judges. And during our recent look at some heroes of the Bible, we looked at some of our favorite heroes. One of the things we found is that several of them come from the book of Judges. It just seemed like those are some of the popular heroes we pick. And so the story of Ruth is from that same time period. Not one of the heroes, but or of the judges, but that time period of the judges. And as we look at this section of God's Word over the next couple weeks, we should see how it will connect to our lives and how we deal with family. My hope is that will be useful for us as we face Thanksgiving. We often encounter family, and so maybe it's a good thing to think on that. But we also should see how it might connect a little bit to Christmas as well, as we get to the end of the book of Ruth. And so we'll look at it at this time of the year. Without further ado, we'll turn to Ruth chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. A man left Bethlehem in Judah and with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the fields of Moab and settled there. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. After they lived in Moab for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. She and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. She left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. Naomi said to each of them, "Each of you, go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband." She kissed them, and they wept loudly. They said to her, "We insist on returning with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Again they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me, and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. The 2 of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival, and the local women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," she answered, "for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law Ruth the Moabitess. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So Ruth's story begins with a famine in the land of Judah. This was during the time of the judges, and God would do things like that. He would sometimes send a famine to get people's attention when they had sinned. We see that through the book of Judges and actually also through the Kings. We're not really given any details surrounding these events, just that there was a famine and Naomi's family moved to Moab. When hard times came, they got out of town. Okay? If the place you lived in had no food, and likely as a result had no work, would you move somewhere else? I mean, maybe you move somewhere where you could find food and make a living. This is what Elimelech did, Naomi's husband. He moved his family to Moab where they could live and have food. And I do have a little map here that kind of shows us a little bit of location. They started over here in Bethlehem. I put a little star for where Bethlehem is, and which was a pretty small town, at this point. And they moved all the way over here to Moab. I have that highlighted here, which is on the other side of the Dead Sea. And so they moved across, to the other side where there was food. The Moabites were descended from Moab. Go figure. Okay. Yes, they were descended from Moab, which was the son of Lot and his oldest daughter. You can read about that in Genesis. They were kind of, cousins to the Jewish people, you might say. Interestingly enough, the Moabite language was one of the Northwest Semitic languages, which means it was really in the same language family as Hebrew. So basically, they were different dialects of the same language. It would be kind of like, if you lost your job and you had to move down to Louisiana to get a new job. Okay. The people there speak English, sort of. Okay. They sort of speak a dialect of English, you might say. You could communicate, for the most part, you could get by and you would understand one another. And so that would be kind of the dynamic that the Hebrews would experience if they moved to Moab. This linguistic dynamic and also their close ancestral heritage may account for some of the intermingling between these nations. So remember, at this time, Israel is really more of a group of tribal states, a confederation. Each tribe is its own entity. And so these other groups like Moab and Ammon, which are related through Abraham and who speak a very similar language, to them may have not seemed so very different. It might seem like they're just another tribe. And so in this case, they did move there. Now, the big difference between the Israelites and the Moabites or the Ammonites is they worshiped different gods. They did have same culture, same language roughly, but different religion. So anyway, Elimelech, Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, moved from Bethlehem in Judah to the territory of Moab. But after moving there, Elimelech died. He moved there, they set up shop, and then he died. He left Naomi to raise her sons on her own. Now, many might ask, well, why didn't Naomi just go back to Bethlehem at this point? And the first reason, of course, would be that there was famine in Bethlehem. I mean, that's why they left. And we're not really given a time frame. It seems like Elimelech dies quickly after they get there, but there was famine in Bethlehem, and we don't know how long that lasted. And so as far as she knew, there's no food back home, no reason to go back home. But I got to thinking about it, and for us to understand Naomi's actions, it might be helpful for us to think back to the times of the American frontier. Okay, a lot of the book of Judges in that time period, if you think back and put it in the context of the American frontier, you can maybe get a little more, understanding of what was going on. If you lived in a family and your family started west for a new life, okay, you're going to go west, you're going to get, some new land, and you're going to start a homestead. But then the husband died. What would the wife do? Would she just pack up and go home? Or would she keep going on their new farm with the kids? Now, it could go either way, but we can get there where we understand people who moved west with the family. The husband died and the wife kept going with the kids on the farm. Well, that's kind of what Naomi does. They had moved there, they had set up shop, and so she and the boys keep going. Naomi is there with her sons, and they pick wives from the Moabites. It's who they're living with. And so those wives, Mahlon and Chilion, married women named Orpah and Ruth. Now, this is after they had lived in Moab for about 10 years. Then Mahlon and Chilion also die. Okay, they're having a bad string of funerals here. At this point, Naomi probably feels like she has nothing left. You know, it's one thing to keep the farm going when you have your sons who are going to inherit it. I mean, that's part of why you moved there. You wanted something for your kids. You wanted to put food on the table. But now there's no sons to pass along the inheritance to. And furthermore, Naomi has now heard that the Lord has remembered his people, and there's now food in Bethlehem. This venture for her has been a total loss. Naomi had suffered enough, and she's decided she's not going back home. Okay, I think we can get there. We can understand her. Maybe you can relate to Naomi. Have you ever been in a place where you just felt defeated? Maybe you tried a new venture. Maybe a new relationship. Maybe a business. And it all came crashing down, leaving you with nothing for all your investment. Maybe you've been there, where life just collapsed. See, I think that's where Naomi was. And sometimes you're just out of options and you have nowhere to go but back home. And I think that's what we see in Naomi. And so let's pick up again in verse 7, where Naomi is going to go home after the death of her husband and sons. Verse 7, it says, she left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. Naomi said to them, each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband. She kissed them, and they wept loudly. This is a crying book, by the way. Okay, so a lot of crying in here. Naomi left the land that she had gone to in the Moabite area for the land of Judah, and her daughters-in-law went along with her. They had all been living together. Families at that time tended to all live together. But what would her daughters-in-law have in Judah? Probably nothing more than Naomi had in Moab. See, Naomi was going home, but she couldn't promise any kind of life for these young women who had married her sons. She was grateful for their kindness that they had shown her and her family. They were sticking with her through all of this difficulty, but there was nothing she could do for them in return. The best thing for them to do, from her perspective, was to go back to their families there in Moab and try and find a new husband. Go on back home. Now, this does bring us to a cultural difference that I probably need to mention. Okay, there's quite a bit of culture shock when you read through the Judges, okay? In this time period, it's very different from our world. In the ancient world, there was no Social Security, okay? There were no IRAs. There was no pension plans from the company. The way you guaranteed your future when you got too old to work was by having kids. Aren't you glad we don't follow that system anymore? But that is the system that they had. You had kids. You cared for them when they were young, and in return, they cared for you when you got old. Or as my boys actually told me when they were teenagers, be careful how you treat us because we get to pick your nursing home when you get old. That's okay. So there is still some dynamic of this. But back then, there were no nursing homes or even hospitals. Everyone was taken care of by their own family. And while we have shifted greatly in culture and in resources, this responsibility still exists. In fact, this is 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. Paul writes, he says, but if anyone does not provide for his own family, especially for his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. God takes a dim view of people who don't care for their family. It says here, they're worse than an unbeliever. That's pretty bad. And if you're a follower of Christ, then he expects you to walk in his way. You have an obligation to take care of your family. Now, we are blessed in our society. We're blessed that we have a more structured society, and it does provide a lot of resources that they did not have in most of history. You know, we have financial security and medical resources that they could not have even imagined in the ancient world. And that's a blessing, and we should be grateful. However, in the end, we are still responsible before God for taking care of our family. It is a biblical responsibility. Naomi had lost everything. Yes, her husband and her sons, but she'd also lost her retirement. She's lost any hope for the future. She has nothing left. She's probably going back to Bethlehem with the clothes on her back. But she wanted better for Orpah and Ruth than just to share in her hopeless future. If they went back to the Moab, back to their parents' homes, they might have a chance to marry and have children, and then they could have a future that was secure. However, they were trying to do the right thing by their deceased husbands. They're sticking with their mother-in-law. They're on their way back to Bethlehem with her. This, I think, stands in sharp contrast to the sinfulness we see in the book of Judges. See, throughout the book of Judges, God's people are sinning and sinning and sinning and getting worse and worse and worse. But here we have two Moabite women living more righteously than most of God's people. And so we have this bright spot in that time period, the book of Ruth. But let's continue with their story and look at verse 10, Ruth chapter 1. It says, they said to her, we insist on returning with you to your people. But Naomi replied, return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Now, again, this is a thing that is culturally hard for us to understand. In their day, when a woman married a man, she married into his family. Okay, it was not just an individual thing, it was a family commitment. You might think it was almost like she took his last name and everything. I mean, she married into his family. If he died, then it was his brother's duty to marry her and do the duty of the brother-in-law, providing for his brother's wife and getting her pregnant so she would have kids. That was part of the deal. That way she would have children to take care of her when she got old. That was their custom. These children would be recognized as the brothers. It was actually, of that person, even though the brother-in-law is the one who helped produce them. But they would get their brother's share of the inheritance. This is how their society kept on their family name. It's how they kept their property in the family. Remember, particularly with the children of Israel, they all had shares of property lotted out, that each tribe had to keep this property. Well, it wasn't supposed to transfer. This is how they kept it in the family. But it was also how they provided for their elderly years after retirement. You had to have children or there would be no one to take care of you. And you took care of your kids when they were little, and they took care of you when you got old. And this is why when you see someone who is barren or someone who does not have children, it is such a big deal in the ancient world. Okay, in our world, it's not such a big deal, but in their world, it was a big deal because you had no retirement, no plans for the future, no one to take care of you when you got old if you didn't have kids. Now, in our society, this system of marrying the next of kin is probably incomprehensible. Okay, we just can't cope with this concept. We would ask, what if you don't want to marry your brother-in-law? Or what if your sister-in-law was ugly? I mean, we have questions we might ask, But it was part of the marriage contract that they had. So you knew this before you got married. When you married someone, you understood you were marrying their family. And if something happened to your husband, you go to the next brother, which might motivate you to keep your husband alive if you like him, or bump him off if you like the brother better. But back in the day, that's how things worked, okay? By the way, I should mention, this was not just biblical culture. Okay, we probably have a tendency to read this and think this is the way, it was in Bible culture. This is the way God set it up. That's not an accurate concept. This was the practice of most of the ancient Near East cultures, and they all followed it in that region. In fact, it still exists in some places, particularly in India and Africa. where this is still the practice. So if you're getting married in India, here's my advice. If ever you get married in India, read the fine print of the contract real careful, okay, before you sign on the dotted line, because this is still practiced in some places. Naomi pointed out that she didn't have any more sons for these women to marry, okay? She cannot keep her part of the contract, this family obligation. There's no more sons for them to marry to take care of them when they get old. And she says she's too old for another husband at that point. And even if she did get married, even if she got married that very night, even if she did have sons, would Orpah and Ruth really wait until they grew up to marry them? There was really no hope for their future security with her. She could not provide that. And so Naomi felt like God had punished her family. There's no hope for any kind of future. And she says to these young women, my life is just too bitter for you to share in this. Go back. Go live your lives. Go get married. Go be happy. Go have a good life. You don't want to share in what God's done to me. Because they can't follow the custom of marrying the next son. And here I think we see something of family done right. Each member of the family was concerned about the welfare of the others. Orpah and Ruth were trying to take care of Naomi. They were trying to fulfill their obligation to be good daughter-in-laws. And Naomi was trying to take care of Orpah and Ruth and make sure they had their needs met. And each was taking care of the others. And Orpah and Ruth were heading out to Judah even though there was no hope of a husband. And Naomi was willing to send them back even though it would mean living the remainder of her life alone and risking what would happen if she ever got to the stage she couldn't take care of herself. They were each looking out for what was best for the other's interest. And that's something we ourselves ought to do. Now, this continues in verse 14, this discussion between them. Verse 14 says, "Again they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, 'Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law.' But Ruth replied, 'Don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me, and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me.' When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her." So Orpah accepted what Naomi had told her and went back to her parents' home, back to her people. And this was the logical thing to do because there wouldn't be any future for her with Naomi. However, it was also walking away from Naomi, leaving her to fend for herself. Naomi couldn't keep the family contract providing, Orpah with a husband, so Orpah didn't feel required to keep her commitment to care for her mother-in-law. And Naomi kind of let her out of it. I mean, she's telling her, go back. We can't do this. Ruth, on the other hand, makes a much more risky decision. Maybe you might say a faith decision. Based on her love and her loyalty to her new family, she had made a commitment to marry this family, and she was going to keep that commitment, even if Naomi could not provide her with a husband. Even if there seemed like there was no hope, Ruth was going to be good for her commitment. She had married Naomi's son. Naomi was now her mother-in-law, and she was going to stand by it. And here is where I think we see the dynamic of a family done right. Ruth was loyal and faithful to her family commitment, even when it wasn't in her own best interest. Even when it wasn't to her own personal advantage. See, do you want to keep your family commitments when it's convenient? or when it seems beneficial to you personally? Is that the only time you keep your commitments to your family? If you do, then understand you're not being faithful to your family, you're just being faithful to yourself. But this is what we are instructed to do. This is Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 3. It says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility consider others as more important than yourselves. Everyone should look not to his own interest, but rather to the interest of others. Adopt the same attitude as that of Christ Jesus, who, existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant, taking on the likeness of humanity, and when he had come as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." I'm suggesting this morning that to do family right, you have to act like Jesus. You have to humble yourself. You have to put the needs of your family ahead of your own self. If you won't do this for your family, people that you have a bond with, people you are committed to, then how will you do it to people who are not your family? And we are commanded to do this to everyone, just like Jesus did. See, doing family right requires that you act like Jesus and put others ahead of your own self, trusting Him for the outcome. This is what we find in Ruth. She is a young woman who lived in the way that was pleasing to God. And spoiler alert here, I'm going to tell you something about the end of the story. As a result of her faithfulness, God does provide for her, and she actually winds up in the lineage of Christ. This young woman, she was faithful, and it paid off. She was willing to sacrifice her own future to be faithful to her commitments to Naomi's family. She was determined to go with her, to live with her, to worship her God, and eventually even to die and be buried wherever Naomi was buried. She was all in. Now, when I do premarital counseling, which isn't very often, I don't do a lot of weddings, for which I'm kind of grateful. Weddings are actually a lot of work, and not as much. You think weddings would be glamorous and fun, but they're not. Okay. I will give you some free advice of things I've seen wedding coordinators do that, mistakes, never release butterflies underneath the ceiling fan. Okay, free advice for weddings. Now, okay, yes, it goes wrong. So it ruins the mood. I don't do a lot of weddings, but one of the things I do tell a young couple, if I do their wedding, if I'm doing marriage counseling, I tell them that their marriage will only be as strong as their commitment to each other. It's about loyalty and faithfulness. In marriage, you are making a commitment before God, and that commitment will be as strong as your loyalty and faithfulness in that commitment. If your true loyalty is to yourself, then it won't last long. And that, my friends, is why so many marriages fail. Because their true loyalty is not to God, is not to the family unit, is not to the commitment that they made, but to their own selves and what they can get out of the marriage. As soon as it doesn't seem to be to their advantage to continue their commitment, they bail. That didn't work out for me. Because their commitment was really only to their own self. That's where the commitment really lies, their loyalty. And in every relationship, let me tell you, in every relationship, sooner or later, it will seem like the relationship is no longer to your advantage. I don't care what relationship you're in, whether it's a romantic relationship, a marriage relationship, a parent relationship, an employment relationship, the day's coming where you're going to say, this is not fair to me. The day's going to be there where there's going to be some obstacle that you or the other person is getting an advantage that you didn't get. What will you do when that day comes? Will you be faithful to your commitments, even when it's not to your advantage or it doesn't feel like it? See, that is how you develop a family done right. You're committed. You're faithful. You honor your commitment before God. And I think that's what we see Ruth did. She was committed to Naomi to the end. Look at verse 19. It says, the two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem, and they entered Bethlehem. The whole town was excited about their arrival, and the local women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, she answered. For the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me, and the Lord Almighty has afflicted me? Now, if you've been in a small town, let me tell you, it doesn't take much to get people excited. Okay, any news in a small town is big news. Naomi moved back to town, and everybody was talking about it. Oh, they were excited there in Bethlehem. They hadn't seen her for 10 years. I mean, could this really be her? Had she really come back? But for Naomi, this was not an exciting time. This was a sad time. When she left Bethlehem, she had a husband and sons. She went away full, but now she's returning empty. Naomi seems to have seen this as God's judgment on her. Now, we're not told why she felt that way. We don't know, maybe she felt we shouldn't have moved, we shouldn't have done this. Maybe you've looked back on your life and seen things that I wish I hadn't done that. But whatever it was, as a result, she changes her name from Naomi to Mara, or as we might say it, Mary. This is the origin of the word Mary, the name Mary, meaning bitter. Call me bitter. This morning, has life made you bitter? You have things in your life that just hurt, that are sore, that are difficult. You're saying, God, why me? Do you feel like God has been judging you? Like your life has just been one tragedy after the next and there's no hope left? Now, if that's where you are, I have good news for you this morning. See, with Jesus, there's always hope. With God, there is always hope. And actually, Naomi is going to be blessed. Ruth is going to be blessed. The story doesn't end in chapter 1. We get to keep going. But understand, for us, the world will disappoint you. The world will let you down. The world will even abandon you once you're of no more use to them. And people will mistreat you. You may feel sometimes like God has been judging you. But the good news for us is that Christ has taken all of our judgment. Jesus took our judgment on the cross. So through him, there is hope of blessing, even if we've made wrong decisions, even if we've made wrong choices, even if our past is messed up, there is hope of blessings. Even if everything bad has happened to you, God can still give you a good future. See, will you put your faith in Christ? Will you walk in his ways? And that may take sacrifice. See, Ruth was sacrificing. Ruth was going headlong into an uncertain future, trusting that it would work out. She was going to commit herself to Naomi and to the God of Israel. But will you commit yourself to him blindly so you can then experience his blessing? Now, we'll see in future weeks that is kind of what Ruth does and how her story goes. She committed herself to God and to Naomi, and she does seem to be a woman who was walking in his way. She's doing the things that we read in the Bible we're supposed to do. Honoring her mother-in-law, taking care of her in her old age, being faithful, and she's committed to the end. And as a result, she was greatly blessed. Verse 22 kind of gives us a summation or a conclusion of this chapter. It says, so Naomi came back to the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law Ruth the Moabitess. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, we probably just glance over that normally. But the timing of Naomi and Ruth arriving in Bethlehem is interesting. It was at the beginning of the barley harvest. That would put them there in very early spring, right in time for Passover. They would have got back just in time for Passover. Just in time to remember how God had brought his people out of bondage, out of death and hopelessness, so he could bless them in the promised land. And here we see this microcosm of this, of God bringing Naomi back, bringing Ruth, so he could bless them there again in the promised land. Now, I know we live in uncertain times. You turn on the news, there's all kinds of upheaval in the world. Many of you I know face difficulties personally. I mean, you have things in your life that are difficult. You face discouragement. Maybe you even face grief, loss of loved ones and family. But I want to encourage you. I want to encourage you this morning as you face another week in this world, as we keep looking for Jesus to come back, keep your eyes on Jesus. Keep your eyes on Jesus. As you go out into the world, look to Jesus. Trust him to see you through, to lift you up at the proper time. Put yourself in his hands. Commit yourself to living according to the way of Christ and trust him for the outcome. Trust him for the blessing if you do what's right.